I've taken a drug. I don't feel very proud about that. I don't think I said it to very many people for many years that I was taking such a drug. So now I'm going to go back on the drugs that have caused me all this trouble, but coming off them causes me, even worse trouble. I felt really trapped. I quickly realized, hold on, the evidence for all the drugs we use are based on crummy studies. They're all based on stopping the drugs quickly. They all ignore withdrawal effects. It's bloody obvious to me that anybody that comes off these drugs quickly is going to get into huge trouble that's nothing to do with relapse.
So, Mark, thanks for being here today. Let's just jump right in.
Sure.
I want to start and ask you, I want to ask you about your initial experiences with psych diagnoses and psych drugs. But before we get to that, could you fill in for us a little bit about your life prior to encountering the system?
Okay. So I'm Australian. I grew up in Sydney. I grew up in the eastern suburbs of Sydney. If you've heard of Bondi Beach, it's a very nice part of the world. I grew up near there. I wasn't very good at surfing. I grew up in a Jewish family, probably very focused on professional achievements. In Sydney, my father is an eye surgeon. My mother's a pharmacist. A lot of people in our family are doctors or something medical associated. I went to a selective private school in Australia. It's an Aussie knockoff of Eton, basically. But it's a lot more basic. The Aussie version. So three-piece suits. Grey suits, standing up for the masters when they walk into class, examinations from the age of 5 onwards, basically. And I was a very good student, very academically inclined, very good at memorizing things for exams, and maybe in my family. There's a big sense of humour, a lot of watching Seinfeld and Woody Allen films and The Simpsons growing up. And I've got 2 younger sisters. That's a broad brushstrokes of my world. And I went to medical school after high school.
And was medical school always sort of the plan for you? What drew you towards medicine?
So I was a very conflicted young man. So I was yearning to rebel against everything around me, and so I wanted to be. I was an aspiring writer and scientist, I would have said, if you'd talked to me back then. And yet I felt a magnetic pull towards things like medicine and law, which were that was the sort of marching. That was the song in the background of my school. And so when I applied for different courses, I had down medicine, philosophy, and physics, and I ended up getting into medicine. Although I was very, very ambivalent about it right from the beginning. I was very reluctant to do it. Yeah, there was some inbuilt, nothing explicit, but there was some inbuilt cultural expectations of the sort of person I was, at the sort of school I was on, I was at, sort of family I was in, that made sense. And of course, my father was a doctor. There was it was in the water around me.
It was not a shock to hear that you were considering entering medicine as a field. There was no
it was certainly not a shock. Yeah, exactly.
So from there, what, I don't want to say what changed, because it doesn't sound like anything necessarily had to change, but in hindsight, your first encounter with psychiatric treatment, or say, let's just say the broader paradigm of mental health care, whatever you want to call it, was that sort of destined for you? Just sort of the type of kid that you were and the situation that you were in? Do you feel like that was probably an eventuality that you were going to find yourself in a first appointment at some point?
I think the thing that got me, the thing that put me on a trajectory towards the mental health system or towards mental health medications was my experience in primary school and high school. So I was very short, very young. I think I was one of the youngest in the year, if not the youngest. You know, very good academically, and I wanted people to know that. And I think that's where a refugee mentality comes into things. So I was taught at home, to strive. And I think, the polite term would be I attracted negative attention from my social group. In other words, I was badly bullied for years. I also had a Jufro. Now my hair is I'm rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic, but back then, I had like a 30 centimeter high. I'll have to send you a photo. 30 centimeter high Jufro, which also made me a figure of fun. And so I was bullied particularly by a guy in my year who was an academic rival of mine, but a foot taller, went through puberty. He may as well have been 4 years older than me. And he sort of led a group, and they threw me in the bin at lunchtime. They made fun of me. I went through whatever, probably regular level horrific bullying during primary school, and that had a huge effect on me. It caused me huge amounts of shame. It created my self-esteem. It made me very nervous to go to school, and it continued in differing degrees at high school with a little bit more sophistication, not quite person in the bin, but the kind of emotional warfare that young people can generate towards each other. So that was probably the major thing in my life. If I was asked at the age of 15, why are you so miserable, Horowitz, which I was, if I'd be able to articulate, it would have been because I felt, bullied, very, very maligned by groups at school. And I was extremely dysfunctional in my response to it, although I've been told it's not the most abnormal response. Rather than running from it, I spent years trying to make these people like me. So I had this incredible response. Actually, someone told me there's fight, flight, fright, and also there's another one where you're trying to make them like you. I can't remember what the word is.
Is it fawn?
Fawn. Yeah, fawn. So I went hardcore on fawning, which I think was highly pathological. When I look back on things that I'm ashamed about, I'm particularly ashamed about my response to the whole process. But anyway, I actually met a friend of mine recently who said, I spent all of primary school being bullied and all of secondary school trying to make the bullies like me. And she said, I did the same thing, which was a bit nice to hear. And that basically meant, so I sort of had this kind of dual world. I did have some friends in high school, some genuine friends, but I sort of had this kind of negative thing on me all the time. I was very academically successful. So I think I was putting out a lot of green lights to people. People thought, look, this guy's topping exams, he's getting prizes, everything's okay. So I had the opposite orientation to most people. I felt class was safe, lunchtime was much less of a happy place. And so I was quietly miserable. I kept a diary at that time, which I've got, which I plan to look through when I write my comic memoir. That's full of misery. That's full of, I feel miserable. Life is awful. And so when I've sort of, it a little bit informs why I did medicine actually. If I'd been a self-confident person, I would have done writing and science. I would have done, science and writing. I would have taken a bit of a risk. But because I sort of had such a low sense of my self-worth, I sort of thought I'm clever, but basically I feel so worthless. I kind of didn't make a bold move. I sort of thought, I'll sort of do, I don't know what I sort of thought, I'll do what is sort of safe or easier in some way. And so medicine was kind of, I sort of thought of it as a low self-esteem choice for me. I had the marks for it. So I know lots of people out there aspire to do medicine, but for me it was sort of, it was a bit of a safe choice. So basically I'm kind of a miserable character. I'm doing a course I don't really love. I come in without a great sense of my self-worth. I go away. I'm also not doing that well at medical school because I'm very unengaged. I decided to go away for a year, and going away to that small town was very isolating. I felt it made me feel quite lonely and quite depressed. I was sort of too embarrassed to borrow a book that said, how to feel better. But I would, so I stole books from the library. I stole. I apologise to the Port Macquarie Library if you're listening. I'll bring the book back. I took a book called Why You Can't Afford the Luxury of a Negative Thought, which is basically a CBT book, and another couple of CBT books on how to be less of a miserable bastard. And I was also reading Kafka, and I was reading Nietzsche. I was sort of trying to work out. I sort of had a sense of myself that I'm miserable because I'm a great intellectual, and just like Kafka and just like Nietzsche, and if I can, it's part of my intellectual and philosophical journey to work through whatever. I had all sorts of different ideas. I'm reading CBT on one hand, and I'm reading Nietzsche on the other hand, and I basically thought, look, I am miserable. I wake up in the mornings, I'm exhausted, I can't keep up with people at work. My sleep patterns were off. I also, it's another little thing. I definitely have a delayed phase sleep kind of thing. I'm definitely a night owl. A lot of teenagers are, but I think I've got it worse than the average. I remember kind of thinking, I either need to change everything in my life about what I'm doing and who I am, or there's something wrong with me. I don't know if I articulated it that clearly to myself, but I had something like that in my mind. And for whatever reason, I decided, I'm going to go see a doctor. So I don't know if I decided that it must be something wrong with me rather than being this philosophical existential dilemma, but I ended up in my family doctor's office at the age of about 21 saying, sort of very full of shame, very nervous, working up the courage to say to her, I think I'm depressed and I think I need something. And I sort of think about, where do those ideas come from? I think in my family, one, my mother's a pharmacist that I mentioned. It is a very medical kind of milieu there. So that growing up in my family, there was a ceiling to floor cupboard in our kitchen full of medications. For nausea, for headache, for whatever. I sort of wonder if it was her influence, if it was lectures at university. I heard about these drugs and they all sounded pretty safe and effective. And I sort of think people in my family or my friends may have been on them. So for whatever reason, it seemed incredibly normal for me to walk in on a Tuesday afternoon to my GP's office to ask for an antidepressant, which is basically what I did. And I remember being extremely excited to try it. I remember thinking, all of these troubles that I've had for months or years, all these dark thoughts, it's about to be washed away. This is amazing. And I basically ran to the pharmacy to get the script filled. And there was green and white capsules, and I popped them open, and I was excited to put it in my mouth. And I think the main things I had were, I had a lot of weird side effects. I remember feeling a bit intoxicated, a bit drug affected. I had used ecstasy maybe 3 times by the age of 21 in my more wayward youthful years. And I felt a little bit like that, not as strong as that, but I felt a bit like things around me were a bit different. They were a bit altered. It wasn't that I was going to, go raving for 6 hours at the local nightclub, but I just felt like things were a bit like I'd had 1.5 beers, and I had this funny yawning, and I felt a bit dizzy. And I think I went back after about 2 weeks and said, I don't think these things suit me very well. I've got all these funny sensations. He said, okay, let's try another one. I don't know if that one was Zoloft or something else, but I tried Zoloft, and I had similar effects to the Prozac or fluoxetine. Again, I felt a bit drug affected. I felt a bit woozy. I came back a third time. A few weeks later, I said, I don't think this one suits me. And she gave me Lexapro or escitalopram. And I went and took that, and I can't remember the exact details of it, but I think I had similar effects, but I just sort of thought, they're obviously all the same. I'll just stick on this one. I can't be bothered going back again. And people always ask me, did it improve your mood did it fix things? And I can't even really remember. I certainly don't think it made me, feel a whole lot better. I can't really remember. It made me feel differently, definitely. I do remember at that point, I was actually doing a psychology degree alongside my medical degree. And I remember writing an essay in which I knocked the crap out of psychology. And I remember thinking, this is a little bit uncharacteristic for me to be so kind of rude. I was sort of having a go at my lecture. And I remember thinking, I'm a little bit disinhibited, actually. I'm being a little bit risque in this essay, and I'm being a little bit, I wouldn't normally, be like this. I'd normally be trying to get a good mark. So I remember feeling I'm a little bit high, maybe, on these drugs. And then when I got the mark back, which wasn't very good, I sort of wrote, by then I was a little bit more sober. I wrote something back saying, oh, I think you misunderstood this. And I rewrote the essay a little bit, and I tried to make it a little bit more conventional.
During in school, you're being bullied quite a lot. As you get older, you're experiencing, as a result of that bullying, a sense of inadequacy in yourself. I mean, this is what I'm hearing you describe.
Yeah.
Did you have, at any point, and I think this is true for most people, and it shifts over time, but at any point, did you have any sort of specific name for, or any specificity at all around the deficit that you possessed? Like, what was wrong with you, or what were you lacking?
Yeah.
And then sort of the natural follow-up to that is, did that square with what led you to seek psych treatment? Because oftentimes people do pursue psych treatment because, they understand that especially drug treatment can correct an imbalance or a deficiency.
Yeah. So the answer is I definitely didn't think that. Sorry to ruin the narrative. If I go back to my adolescent diary, I'm sure it was full of the word depression. I've got depression. But I guess, I never really thought that means I've got a biochemical deficit, that there's something wrong with me. I mean, I sort of understood it as being, I'm having a miserable time in life, so I'm depressed. I also thought, this sort of fits into the Kafka, Nietzsche, Woody Allen, Philip Roth, this low mood is a little bit a part of being talented. This is a sign of, artistic depth. I was reading a lot of Salinger. Like any adolescent, I'm listening to Radiohead. I kind of thought this is, if I was brave enough, I would have worn eyeliner and black clothes, but I wasn't brave enough. So I sort of thought this all fit into this deep feelings. So I sort of, in some ways, I remember saying to a family member who also had low mood something about, you shouldn't use antidepressants because Nietzsche didn't use antidepressants. This is part of the dilemma of being human. And you solve existential problems by solving them, not by using drugs. So that was a little mini lecture I gave to a family member early on. So something in my mind must have been, reading this philosophy, thinking about things in a different way. And so I sort of remember, whenever I went in at the age of 21 with my tail between my legs to my GP, there was something shameful really about asking for drugs and about, I remember going into the GP's office, to squeak out in my little voice, I think I'm depressed. I want drugs. It felt very shameful, like giving in, like I wasn't taking, I wasn't doing whatever Nietzsche would have done.
Safe to assume, though, for some people, they encounter sort of like the biological reductionist perspective on whatever their diagnosis might be or whatever the treatment they're engaging in is, and it feels like a revelation to them. That was certainly not your experience.
I don't think so. I sort of, going back to that thing when I thought everything was wrong in my life, I need to change everything. I sort of still felt that. I sort of still felt like I tried to formulate myself in my diary. I'd say, I'm like this because of what happened at high school, and because I'm, haven't taken decisive action to change my course, and I'm too introspective and I ruminate too much. And this self-help book is saying I should, write down 10 things to do for the day, and I should. So I sort of felt like I've taken a bit of a cop out. I haven't changed who I am. I haven't solved these existential dilemmas. I've taken a drug. I don't feel very proud about that. I don't think I said it to very many people for many years that I was taking such a drug. So I didn't really walk out with that thing that some people have. Well, I've got a diagnosis now. It's not my fault. The drug will fix things. I hadn't taken the high road, is what I felt.
Mm-hmm. Was there a formal diagnosis, I guess, is something I didn't hear. Did more follow?
Yeah. I walked into my GP's office and said, I think I'm depressed. She said, yeah, you seem, I can't remember what she said. I think she would have said, yeah, you seem depressed. I don't remember there being, there wasn't sort of a DSM pulled out or a major depressive disorder anointed. So I think things are a bit more casual in Australia probably altogether, but I think it's probably true of most doctor interactions. It wasn't all very formal. Were further drugs added. So then the story after that was I had a lot of trouble for years with daytime tiredness and fatigue and memory and concentration issues. So I had real issues with tiredness during university. So I would fall asleep in lectures. I was exhausted a lot of the time. And I began to take naps in different places. I would steal away, especially at hospital. So to some degree at university, it's a bit more, taking naps in the library is kind of almost normal. It became more abnormal as I got into working as a doctor. I remember thinking, I really can't keep up with people around me, and I would steal off to the on-call room to have a nap in the middle of the day. I would, I'd close my eyes in the bathroom. I was doing things, to have rest. To the point where I was a first-year psychiatry trainee. Now I'm sort of 28 in Sydney, and I would go to my car almost every lunchtime to have a nap, and I would set up. In Sydney is very sunny, so I'd set up these kind of aluminium things that you'd put up to protect your car from sun, but I'd use it to hide from people around me, so they wouldn't see that I was in my car asleep. And I had this fear that my bosses would walk by and catch me asleep in the car. And I was I was exhausted going through the day. I'd have huge amounts of coffee to try to wake myself up, and I felt it was like the overriding sensation of that entire time, just how exhausted I was. And again, being medically inclined, I went to see doctors to get diagnoses, and I got various different diagnoses. I went to a chronic fatigue doctor, and I got a diagnosis of chronic fatigue syndrome. And I went to a doctor who was a sleep physician, and they diagnosed me with narcolepsy. I was given stimulant medication for that. That was Ritalin, modafinil, and all of these drugs made me feel horribly anxious. And so I tried this one and I tried that one and I stopped that, and I developed a spreadsheet to work out if I take half a dose at midday and 3/4 at 3 o'clock, and I stop it and I have nothing after 5. Can I sleep at night and not feel too anxious and feel a bit more awake? And so I became this kind of self-experimenting person with stimulants. When to take them to try to maintain wakefulness and alertness and not become very anxious. And basically it never quite worked. I became a bit of a wellness bro, or a self-experimenter, because I was just trying to do whatever I could to become less tired. So, I took up intermittent fasting. I took up carnivore diet, a paleo diet, exercise, this supplement, that's, I did anything I could to try to get an edge on feeling tired. Light box in the morning, no light at night time, melatonin. I did everything possible, with spreadsheets to try to work it, because it was really having a big effect on my life. I was not performing well at work, and that's the point at which I went to do a PhD in London. And I did that for 2 reasons. One, because I wanted to, sort of in the cliche, I wanted to work out, what was happening with me, why I was depressed, what do antidepressants do. But number 2, because I couldn't keep up with clinical work. I was so tired that I thought, I'm not doing a very good job here. I should go back to academic work where it's a bit more flexible. That basically brings me into my early 30s, where I'm doing a PhD in London, and then I read about an article about withdrawal effects from antidepressants.
So was your first exposure to the idea of antidepressant withdrawal was in an article?
Yeah. So basically, there was a blog, semi-popular in the UK, that would explore psychiatric issues in an easily digestible way called the Mental Elf. So rather than being about mental health, it was mental elf. That was the gag, and it was an article about. It was by there's a Giovanni Fava wrote a review about withdrawal effects from antidepressants in 2015, and this was a blog about that paper, and I read it and I found it shocking, basically.
Shocking how?
It was basically talking about antidepressants. They sounded like people were coming off heroin. People were getting withdrawal. They were getting electric shocks. They were getting fatigued. They were getting headaches. And I thought, this little drug that I've been taking now for 13 years is causing people to have all these symptoms. And I had two thoughts about drugs that cause withdrawal effects. Number one, which my field spends a lot of time denying, but any drug that causes withdrawal effects also causes tolerance effects. The more you become accustomed to a drug, the more you miss it when it's gone. So tolerance and withdrawal are flip sides of the same coin. That was obvious to me then, it's obvious to me now. So I thought, hold on, a drug that causes withdrawal, I've been on for 13 years, how can it be doing anything after 13 years? The same, if you have the same kind of cup of coffee for 13 years, it doesn't do almost anything to you. And number two, drugs that cause withdrawal are drugs like Valium and Ativan and Xanax, which I know America's a different culture, but those drugs, are seen as very dangerous drugs in Australia and the UK. Those are drugs you don't want to be taking. I was taught, don't give these to patients unless you really need to because they cause all sorts of trouble. And of course, OxyContin or opioids cause withdrawal. So I thought, hold on, I'm on a drug that causes the same sorts of things as these dangerous drugs. What's going on here? I was sort of irritable. I'm thinking I can barely keep up with my PhD, and have a relationship. I'm barely holding things together. So I had, it was a huge stress in my life. And one of the things on my list, it wasn't at the top, but it was somewhere in the middle, was maybe the drugs that I'm on are causing this. And so reading this article about antidepressant withdrawal was sort of enough to push me over the edge to think, well, it's been on my list, it's my list at number 10, maybe come off my antidepressant. This pushed it to number 1. And so I thought, I'm gonna try to come off my drug. If it causes withdrawal effects, I don't think I should be on this. And that's what sort of stimulated me to try to come off the drug.
So walk us through what happened when you did, start on this new mission. It's now your top priority. It's the top of your spreadsheet. It's what you're focused on. Your eyes are open in the morning and you're like, okay, this is my new number one thing. So walk us through that a little bit.
I basically went and read all the papers that my professors had written on how to come off the drugs. I was working with, I was working at one of the top institutes in the world. I want to do this. So a lot of them, were top people, and they said, discontinuation symptoms are brief and mild, and you can come off in 4 weeks. I thought, oh, that doesn't sound too bad. I looked it up and I found, I think, Surviving Antidepressants Pretty Soon and a few other, answers.com or whatever. And people said these drugs are really hard to come off. We get horrible symptoms. It's taken us months to years. And I read about, filing down tablets and opening up capsules and beads and liquids. And I thought that sounds pretty plausible. That makes sense to me. That doesn't sound crazy. And so I sort of split the difference. I thought I'll kind of go halfway. I won't go as quickly as my professors and the guidelines say. And I won't go into full-on overkill like people online. And I thought I'd come off over 4 months. I'd halve my dose every month for 4 or 5 months. And I got down to 1 milligram of Lexapro, which is, much smaller than the smallest tablet. Things got pretty awful. I had trouble sleeping. I'd wake up, in full-blown panic. My heart beating, palms sweaty, feeling like I was being chased by a wild animal or on the edge of a cliff. And I would feel that level of terror and panic, for 10 or 11 hours of the day. I'd feel a bit of relief in the evenings. I felt very derealized. Things around me appeared not real. I felt dizzy. And I was working at that time at the National Psychosis Unit, one of the kind of top units in the country for dealing with people with psychosis. I was working, I think, 3 days a week. I'd finished my PhD. and I was sort of like crawling to work. I remember I was getting a lift with another psychiatry trainee. And I was thinking I've just got to hold it together for this car ride. Just try to act normal. I kind of got through the day. I'd sort of take naps in the bathroom. I'd sort of run away at the end of the day. The days off I would sort of spend in bed. I took up running. I ran kilometre after kilometre. I ran until my feet bled because it gave me a bit of relief. I was sort of, I'd live in terror of the mornings. The mornings were sort of absolutely terrifying to me. I thought, the other thing is, in reading these forums, I came across all these people saying that being on antidepressants had made them fatigued, that they ended up napping during the day, that some of them had been diagnosed with chronic fatigue syndrome and narcolepsy. And I thought, oh my God, this must be what has happened to me. And for the first time in my life, I thought, maybe I'd be better off dead. And I thought, I should go back on the drug because, I think that going back on the drug makes things better. But now I'm going to go back on a drug that's caused me all these health problems. Because I started to think probably the last 10 years or 13 years of being tired all the time is probably because of these drugs. So now I'm going to go back on the drugs that have caused me all this trouble. But coming off them causes me, even worse trouble. I felt really trapped. I ended up going back on the drugs. I think I went up by a milligram every week or two. And after a couple of months, things settled down. And I thought, I'm back on these drugs, not because they're helpful, but because I can't get off them, because I almost died coming off them. And I put it in the back of my mind for a couple of years. I went back to training in psychiatry. I didn't really stick my finger into all this stuff. I sort of thought the drugs are harder to come off than people are telling me at work. But I didn't really get into, what do the drugs do, or what does this mean about the drugs? I kind of had this sense that smaller doses do more than people think, and the drugs are harder to stop. But I basically went back into mainstream psychiatry without major qualms. I had the odd debate with somebody. They laughed at this person for being on a small dose, and I said that's not a small dose because of the way the drugs work. But I basically went back into normal psychiatric play. So now I'm on 5 drugs. I'm on 2 antidepressants. I'm on a stimulant. I'm on a sleeping tablet or a Z drug, and I'm on Xyrem, the specialist drug for narcolepsy, and I'm seeing a lot more. That's actually the first time I saw a psychiatrist in my life. And I was basically worse than I've ever been. I was finding it hard to think straight at work. I was sort of wandering around my hospital with a clipboard, writing down anything that anybody said to me, because if I didn't write it down, I couldn't remember anything. My memory, was like a goldfish's. I began to think, I'm napping. I'd arranged to have naps in the on-call room for my narcolepsy. I was working 2.5 days a week. It's all I could handle. I remember thinking, this is starting to get unethical for me to practice medicine because I am faking it. I can't remember things. And basically I had a supportive boss at that time, and I, rather than have ECT or take lithium or clomipramine or be admitted, I elected for the bourgeoisie middle class alternative, and I went for a trip to Thailand to a yoga and meditation retreat. I took the slightly cliched option there, and I took a break for 8 days. I went to this retreat, and I did all this walking meditation, and I basically decided, I'm on all these drugs now. I'm doing as badly as I've ever done in my life. Why am I even on these drugs to start with? It's because I have these, negative thoughts about what happened at school that come up sometimes. Do I really need to have these drugs to deal with that? And that's when I decided to come off the drugs. And to summarize a long story, I read Surviving Antidepressants. I read The Withdrawal Project. I didn't read papers by my professors. I thought, I know who the experts are now. The people on these websites that have had trouble coming off the drugs. And I basically followed, what's now called a hyperbolic taper, reducing by a certain proportion every month. And, I started in Thailand. I took a couple of months, I took leave. I never went back to that job after I left it. I think I started off with tablets. I got a liquid. I went down by 10% every month. A lot of my daytime fatigue and memory and concentration problems started to resolve as I went down on the drugs. And I started to think, things that I'd been taught about psychiatric drugs, nothing was as it seems. And that's when I really I felt like the scales dropped from my eyes. And I went to work with Joanna Moncrief in London, on this trial to help people stop antipsychotics, because I thought, this is the most important work to be doing in this area is to how to help people stop these drugs. And then, that's what I've done. The last few years, that's what my work has been about.
So this moment when the scales fall off your eyes, it's interesting that your first trip around the merry-go-round, that initial attempt at a taper, that was not enough. Going back up on the drug and discovering that through reinstatement, like, this resolves, that's pretty, clear confirmation of what's going on. That was obviously not enough. And, sort of, well, I'm hearing, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm hearing, a sense, even at the time, of you felt as though you had more or less hit a bottom, because you're now on 5 drugs and doing worse than ever. And even that was not enough to sort of, awaken, some people would call an aha moment, or like there's an internal paradigm shift that gets hard to ignore after a certain point. So in your experience, that happened once you started tapering and feeling better from the 5 drugs. And how was that revelation or reorientation? Was that, was it important to have read the work of researchers and journalists working in this space? Was that part of?
Yeah. So I thought about this a bit. So the first time I came off the drugs and had this huge trouble, it did not trigger a huge, maybe I'm not, maybe I'm just not very clever, but it didn't trigger a huge questioning of the psychiatric paradigm. I basically thought these drugs are obviously much harder to come off than people say they are. That was clear to me. And that smaller doses have bigger effects than people think. And I remember when I went back to practice, I remember that I did spot a couple of people with withdrawal effects. Some old guy came off his drugs and became suicidal for the first time in his life. And I said, look, this is probably a withdrawal effect. So it had some imprint on me. But no, it didn't make me think that the entire psychiatric paradigm was nonsense. But I think the thing that unraveled things for me was the books. I'll tell you what, actually, I can even tell you what page it was. The thing that got me, so on surviving antidepressants, they recommended Joseph Glenn Mullen's book. It's called Coming Off Antidepressants, or the Antidepressant Solution. And that book is basically, the drugs can cause withdrawal effects, and coming off them slowly makes more sense. Doesn't quite get the hyperbolic stuff, but he says a lot of useful things. I think it's a very good book. That didn't make me question the paradigm. He had an afterword in it. In the afterword, he said, how has this all happened? How come most doctors don't understand what's going on, and so many people have this trouble? And he wrote, it's a 10-page afterword. And he basically goes through, this is what happened. They reported withdrawal effects in the 1990s. The companies got nervous. They put together a consensus panel. The consensus panel used this phrase, discontinuation symptoms. They wrote lots of papers. They sent it around to lots of doctors to say, these are brief and mild, so that people wouldn't get nervous about the issue, and they would save their product. And on that consensus panel in 1996, organised by Eli Lilly, was the head of my department. So I'd done a PhD under a professor, and my professor was under another professor who was the head of the department. And that professor, Alan Young, hi Alan, was one of the people paid by Eli Lilly to write papers to say that these withdrawal effects were not a big deal. And suddenly I thought, it was a bit like The Usual Suspects. I don't know if you've seen that film where everything is different at the end. I thought, hold on, the guy that was the head of my department, I thought was, too big a shot to even speak to, is being paid by drug companies to minimize the effects of the drugs that I'm now on, that I almost died from. That page, changed the course of my life. I thought, what the hell is going on? I realized that if I'd walked into a doctor's office with these withdrawal effects, I would have been told I've got a panic disorder, or I've got depression, or I've had a relapse. And I hadn't understood in my training that all the evidence for the long-term use of these drugs was based on these trials where they were stopped quickly. So it was obvious to me that all of these studies were based on withdrawal effects being misclassified as relapse. So I sort of thought, this is in reading Anatomy of an Epidemic, I quickly realized, hold on, the evidence for all the drugs we use are based on crummy studies. They're all based on stopping the drugs quickly. They all ignore withdrawal effects. It's bloody obvious to me that anybody that comes off these drugs quickly is going to get into huge trouble that's nothing to do with relapse. And so, within 2 chapters of reading Anatomy of an Epidemic, I thought, well, 95% of my field is based on, bullshit studies.
Taking a pause from this, but I think we should come back to this, but just to check in. So where are you at in relationship to these drugs now?
So I was in Thailand in August 2018. So when I started tapering. It's now October 2024, so it's 6 years later. I started coming off my escitalopram or Lexapro. I tried to be tricky. I poured in other drugs, and then I came off stimulants, came off a sleeping tablet without too much trouble. I made all sorts of errors in the process. I went too quickly at different points, and I've had to go up a higher dose at different points and hold. I've had some setbacks. I was given antibiotics and steroids at one point that made me feel very unwell for about 9 months afterwards. I've also worked incredibly hard the last few years. I hope people have noticed. And in part, that has really slowed down my taper. I've often made, which I'm occasionally kicked myself for, I've often prioritized doing my work over coming off the drugs, which I wish I hadn't actually. But so I've gone slower than I would have otherwise. The last drug that I'm on is mirtazapine or Remeron, which I found particularly hard to come off. I think even harder than Lexapro. I started on 15 milligrams, maybe I was at 30 milligrams at some point, and today I'm on 0.15 milligrams, which might induce some sniggering, but I find every tiny little reduction at this point incredibly hard. So I'm micro tapering off that using a liquid and dilutions, and I really, really, really hope I'm off that in the next few months. When I've gone too quickly, I've had some very bleak periods where I felt very low, very anhedonic, very cognitively impaired. But mostly, I'd sort of say I've been at a sort of 3 out of 10 in my symptoms, and I've sort of worked through the whole period whilst doing all the different bits and pieces that I've been doing. And so I'm hoping I'm in the final lap of the race here.
One thing that seems sort of striking to me is there's a somewhat of a full circle element to this story where, this all sort of kicked off because you found yourself in a context where, maybe you were a bit of a smart aleck and, or what we might call a grade grubber, and your classmates find they don't necessarily like the way in which you're using your intelligence. And now you find yourself in a somewhat similar scenario. Is that fair to say? Because I'm sort of imagining, but many of your colleagues in the profession of psychiatry, I'm sure, find the work that you're doing ranges probably from inconvenient to intolerable for some of these people.
I mean, yes, it's a parallel that I've thought of before. I mean, in some ways, I am being bullied again by colleagues. If you go on Twitter, you see it happen every day of the week. I guess the difference is, when I was younger, I thought it was my fault, and now I don't think that. So it's I know they're angry at me because of what I'm saying, not because of who I am. Where I didn't understand that at the age of 12. So has it come full circle? Maybe in some ways. Maybe I'm yes. In a much, the dragon ended up being a paper dragon or paper tiger. Something like that.
I hope Mark, when you are on Twitter getting harangued by humorless experts, when you are being diminished in stature by bullies in white coats or not, just remember that there are legions of people out there who have never felt particularly warm towards any psychiatrists, or at least not for a very long time, who are huge fans of you, and deservedly so, because your work is vital. And it's my belief, and I hope you can see this, that you are sort of standing in the gap, and either the general public will clue in to the idea that they're going to get better outcomes if they at least take into account the experiences of those who have been through this stuff for themselves, or the sort of expert class is going to say, we're going to lose credibility unless we kind of get with the program. So one way or another, this particular problem, I think, is going to at least shift and maybe even resolve. I'm sure there are going to be plenty of others that remain. But I think your role in all of this could not be overstated. And just thank you so much for this unique view into how you got there and how you came to do this. Truly.
Thanks, Cooper. I'll get you to write that to my mother so she understands why I've tanked my career as well. Thank you.